The crackle of gunfire shattered the peaceful Montana evening as Sarah Matthews huddled behind her homestead's wooden walls, one hand protectively cradling her 8-month pregnant belly. Outside, the ruthless Baker gang closed in, their horses' hooves thundering across her land. That's when a stranger in fine clothes and polished boots appeared, positioning himself between her and certain death. 3 shots rang out, and 3 bullets found their mark in his chest. As Sarah tended his wounds by lamplight, she discovered that beneath his wealthy exterior lay a man searching for something money couldn't buy. But what force could drive a rich man to risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Matthews traced her fingers over the worn leather Bible resting in her lap, its pages marked by a pressed wildflower that served as Thomas's final gift before pneumonia claimed him last winter. Inside, their marriage certificate remained, pristine though the edges had yellowed with time. She often found herself here in the fading light, seeking solace in memories while her child stirred beneath her heart. The homestead creaked around her, boards settling in the cooling evening air. 8 months pregnant, and still the work never ceased. Earlier that day she'd hauled water from the well, fed the chickens, and mended fence posts that the spring storms had loosened. Her back ached fiercely, but pride kept her moving. This land was all she had left of Thomas, and she'd die before letting it slip away. Through the window, she watched storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains. The drought had everyone on edge, especially since the Baker gang had begun circling the territory like vultures. Just yesterday, Mrs. Peterson from the general store had warned her about their latest victims, the Wilson family, forced off their land 2 counties over. Sarah kept Thomas's old rifle loaded and close, though she prayed she'd never need it. Her hands might be calloused from work, but they'd never known the weight of taking a life. Still, with her baby due before harvest, she couldn't afford to show weakness. The gang was like wolves. They could smell fear from miles away. Rising carefully from her rocking chair, Sarah moved to add another log to the dying fire. The nights were still cool enough to need it, and she had to be mindful of her health now more than ever. The local midwife, Ellen, had lectured her just last week about working too hard. But what choice did she have? Hired help cost money she didn't have, and charity wasn't something she could accept, not when she still had strength in her bones. As she stirred the embers, a horse's whinny pierced the twilight. Sarah froze, her heart thundering against her ribs. It came from the direction of town, followed by the distant sound of male voices. Probably just travelers on the main road, she told herself, but her hand drifted to the rifle anyway. These days, you couldn't be too careful. The voices grew clearer, rough, angry tones that set her teeth on edge. Moving carefully to the window, Sarah peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders had stopped at her front gate, their horses stamping restlessly in the gathering dusk. Even in the failing light, she could make out the distinctive red bandana of Jake Baker tied around one man's throat. Her fingers tightened on the rifle's stock as she watched them examine her property. They hadn't moved to open the gate yet, but their very presence felt like a violation. Everything she and Thomas had built together, every dream they'd shared, was contained within these fence lines. The thought of these men violating that sanctuary made her blood run cold. One of the riders spat a stream of tobacco juice onto her soil. "Reckon the widow Matthews might be more reasonable than them Wilsons were," he drawled, loud enough for her to hear through the window. "Ain't natural, a woman trying to run a spread like this on her own." Sarah's jaw clenched. She'd heard those words before, whispered behind hands at church socials or muttered in the general store. But she'd proved them wrong every day since Thomas's passing, keeping the homestead not just surviving, but thriving. The garden was planted, the chickens were laying well, and she had plans to expand the vegetable plot come spring. Her child would be born into a home built on determination, not defeat. The men lingered a few minutes longer before turning their horses back toward town. Sarah watched until they disappeared into the gathering darkness, her heart still racing. She knew this wasn't the end. They'd be back. The Baker gang never let go once they set their sights on something. Settling back into her rocking chair, Sarah opened the Bible again, seeking comfort in its familiar pages. Her fingers found Thomas's last letter, tucked safely between psalms. "Stay strong, my love," he'd written. "You've always been the backbone of our dreams." She would need that strength in the days ahead. As night settled over the homestead, Sarah Matthews made a silent vow to her unborn child. No matter what came, they would face it together, on their own land, standing tall. James Carlton adjusted his custom-made Stetson as he stepped down from his stallion onto the dusty main street of Silver Creek. The hat, like everything else he wore, spoke of wealth. Fine beaver felt shaped by London's finest craftsmen. Yet unlike the rest of his carefully curated wardrobe, this piece showed signs of genuine wear. Small creases in the brim told stories of real ranch work, not just boardroom dealings. Inside the general store, the usual chatter died as he entered. James was used to this reaction. His reputation tended to precede him. At 38, he'd built an empire buying struggling ranches and turning them into profitable ventures. Some called him a vulture, others a savior. Truth was, he'd stopped caring about others' opinions long ago. Mrs. Peterson bustled forward, her grey hair escaping its neat bun. "Mr. Carlton, sir, we weren't expecting someone of your standing in Silver Creek. What brings you to our humble establishment?" He tipped his hat politely, noting how her weathered hands nervously smoothed her apron. "Just passing through, ma'am. Heard tell of some interesting opportunities in these parts." His voice carried the refined edge of Eastern education, but underneath lay the unmistakable drawl of someone who'd known saddle leather and cattle drives. While Mrs. Peterson gathered his basic supplies, James observed the store's other occupants. Two old-timers by the pot-bellied stove sized him up over their coffee cups. A young mother hurriedly ushered her children outside, casting nervous glances his way. Only the grizzled man checking ammunition seemed unimpressed by his presence. "Mighty fine hat," the man commented without looking up. "Bet it's never seen. A real day's work." James smiled slightly, remembering the day he'd earned those creases in the brim. 10 years ago, outside Laramie, 1,000-head cattle drive through the worst spring storms Wyoming could muster. Lost the first hat to a mud pit. Had to break this one in quick. He picked up a box of ammunition himself, checking the caliber with practiced eyes. Sometimes life teaches you the difference between wearing something and earning it. The man's weathered face cracked into a reluctant grin. "Reckon it does at that." As James settled his bill, Mrs. Peterson couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "You mentioned opportunities, Mr. Carlton. The drought's been hard on folks hereabouts. Some say the Baker gang's been taking advantage, pressuring people to sell cheap." "That's so?" James kept his tone neutral, but his eyes sharpened. He'd heard whispers about the Bakers. Their type was becoming all too common in these parts, men who confused brutality with business sense. "Widow Matthews' place would be worth looking at," Mrs. Peterson continued, lowering her voice. "Fine piece of land, good water rights. Though I shouldn't speak of it, poor woman's still grieving and in her condition." James paused in counting out his money. "Condition? Expecting her first. Due before harvest, God willing. Trying to run that spread all alone, stubborn as her late husband was." She shook her head. "Not that I'm suggesting anything untoward, Mr. Carlton, just that a man of your means might see the investment potential." He laid an extra $1 on the counter. "For the local widows' fund, if you have such a thing." Replacing his hat, he added quietly, "I prefer my investments to be mutually beneficial, Mrs. Peterson. Good day." Outside, James mounted his horse, with fluid grace that belied his expensive clothing. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. His fingers traced the brim of his Stetson thoughtfully. He'd come to Silver Creek looking for business opportunities, true enough. But something in Mrs. Peterson's words nagged at him. He'd seen too many small ranchers pushed out by men like the Bakers. Had done some pushing himself, if he was honest. But there'd always been fair offers first, legitimate business dealings. What he'd heard about the Baker gang spoke of something else entirely. Instead of heading back to his hotel room, James turned his horse toward the outskirts of town. He told himself he was just scouting potential investments. But as the last rays of sunlight gilded the distant peaks, he couldn't shake the feeling that Silver Creek might offer something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the land deed spread across her kitchen table, the fresh, crimson droplets marring its surface still wet. One of the Baker gang had delivered it not 10 minutes ago, dropping it on her porch with a message that made her blood run cold. "Blood's already been spilled over this piece of paper, Mom. Shame if any more had to be." The morning sun, streaming through her window, seemed to mock the darkness of the moment. She traced Thomas's signature at the bottom of the deed, remembering the pride in his eyes when they'd first purchased the land. Now those carefully preserved pages bore the stain of violence, a clear message from men who thought they could intimidate a woman alone. From his vantage point on the ridge overlooking the Matthews homestead, James Carlton watched the scene unfold through his field glasses. He'd taken to riding out this way each morning, telling himself it was purely business interest. But something about the quiet dignity with which the widow maintained her property had caught his attention. The way she worked, despite her advancing pregnancy, the careful order of her garden rows, the mended fences, everything spoke of someone fighting to hold on to more than just land. The Baker gang members' visit changed everything. James had seen their type before, had even employed similar tactics in his younger, more ruthless days. But watching them threaten a pregnant woman stirred something he'd thought long buried beneath his businessman's exterior. Sarah emerged from her house, rifle in hand, and began her morning chores with deliberate calm. If not for the slight tremor in her movements, no one would guess she'd just received a death threat. James found himself admiring her composure even as concern gnawed at him. In town, tensions were rising. The saloon buzzed with whispers about the Baker gang's latest moves. James sat at a corner table, nursing a coffee and listening. Jake Baker himself had been seen riding with a larger group than usual, and word was they'd bought up every spare bullet in the general store. "Heard tell they gave the widow Matthews till the end of the week," an old-timer muttered. "Shame that. Thomas Matthews was a good man." "Ain't natural, her trying to hold that place alone," another replied. "Better to sell before things get ugly." James's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, the same words he'd heard countless times in other towns, justifying the strong pushing out the weak. He'd built his fortune on such transactions, though he'd always prided himself on operating within the law. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. 3 of Baker's men were roughing up a young ranch hand who'd apparently spoken against them. James watched through the window as they knocked the boy down, his face bloodied. Without conscious thought, James found himself moving, his boots striking the wooden sidewalk with purpose. "That's enough," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of wealth and influence. The gang members turned, sizing him up. James kept his stance relaxed but ready, one hand resting near his gun. The expensive weapon had never been fired in anger, but they didn't need to know that. "This ain't your business, fancy man," the largest thug growled. "Everything in Silver Creek is my business," James replied coolly. "I'm considering some major investments here. Property values tend to drop when blood starts flowing in the streets." It wasn't his most noble moment, hiding behind money and influence, but it worked. The men backed off, helping the ranch hand up with exaggerated courtesy before slinking away. As James helped the young man clean up, his mind wandered back to the widow's homestead. The Baker gang wouldn't be deterred for long. They'd read his interference as weakness, maybe even tried to make an example of him. Good business sense said to ride out now, find another town, another investment opportunity. But as he watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire, James Carlton realized he was tired of good business sense. Tired of watching the strong devour the weak. Tired of being the man in the fine clothes who always walked away. Up on her homestead, Sarah Matthews would be securing her property for the night, checking locks and loading weapons, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she prepared for whatever might come. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't alone anymore. James mounted his horse and turned toward his hotel, plans already forming. Sometimes a man had to choose between smart investments and right ones. For the first time in years, the weight of his custom, Stetson felt like more than just a costume. The 3 spent bullet casings gleamed dully in the dirt, still warm from their deadly purpose. Sarah would later collect them, keeping them as a reminder of the moment everything changed. But for now, they lay forgotten as chaos erupted around her homestead. The attack came just before dusk, when the setting sun painted long shadows across her land. Sarah had been hanging laundry, taking advantage of the day's last light, when she heard the first hoofbeats. 6 riders approached her fence line, led by Jake Baker himself, red bandana bright as blood against his throat. "Evening." "Widow Matthews," Baker called out, his voice carrying false courtesy. "Thought on our offer any?" Sarah's hands steadied as she reached for the rifle hidden behind her wash basket. "Nothing to think about, Mr. Baker. This land's not for sale." Baker's friendly mask slipped. "Ain't asking any more, ma'am. World's changing. Ain't no place for a woman trying to play rancher, especially not in your condition." His eyes dropped meaningfully to her swollen belly. The threat in his words was clear as crystal. Sarah backed toward her house, rifle raised. "I suggest you leave my property, Mr. Baker. I'm not as helpless as you might think." The gang leader's laugh was ugly. "Reckon you'll need more than 1 rifle against 6 of us, widow." He nodded to his men. "Burn her out. She'll be reasonable once she's got nowhere to sleep." The first torch arced through the air, landing near her woodpile. Sarah's shot rang out, splintering the fence post next to Baker's head. "That's your warning," she called, voice steady despite her racing heart. "Next one won't miss." "Kill the bitch," Baker snarled, and hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Sarah ducked behind the water barrel, returning fire when she could. A bullet splintered the wood near her head, another shattered a window. She counted her shots carefully. 5 left, then 4. "Not enough," her mind screamed. Not nearly enough. The crack of a new rifle split the air. From the corner of her eye, Sarah saw a rider approaching fast from the town road. James Carlton's fine clothes were dark against his horse's pale coat as he galloped into the fray, firing with deadly precision. "Mrs. Matthews!" he shouted. "Get inside!" She wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but the baby kicked hard against her ribs, reminding her of other responsibilities. Sarah backed toward her door, providing covering fire as James dismounted smoothly and took position between her and the attackers. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. 3 of Baker's men fired simultaneously. James didn't flinch, didn't dive for cover. He stood his ground, returning fire even as the bullets found their mark. Sarah saw the impacts rock him backward, 1, 2, 3 hits to his chest. Yet somehow he remained standing, his own shots dropping 2 attackers from their saddles. Baker and his remaining men wheeled their horses, suddenly facing more resistance than they'd bargained for. As they retreated into the gathering darkness, James Carlton finally allowed himself to collapse. Sarah reached him just as his knees buckled. Blood darkened his expensive vest, spreading in 3 distinct circles. "Inside," she commanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "Can you walk?" He managed a pained smile. "Didn't ride all this way to die in the dirt." Together, they stumbled through her door as the first drops of rain began to fall, nature itself moving to quench the fires Baker's men had started. By lamplight, Sarah cut away James's ruined clothing. The wounds were serious, but not immediately. Fatal. One bullet had struck his shoulder, another his upper chest, and the third had grazed his ribs. As she cleaned and bandaged him with shaking hands, he drifted in and out of consciousness. "Why?" she asked during one of his lucid moments. "Why risk your life for a stranger?" James's eyes focused on her face, surprisingly clear despite his pain. "Saw you hanging laundry yesterday, mending fences day before, fighting so hard. For something worth keeping," he coughed, wincing. "Made me remember what it was like before money became everything." Sarah's hands stilled on his bandages. "Memories aren't worth dying for, Mr. Carlton." "James," he corrected softly. "And maybe I needed to remember what living for something felt like." Through the night, Sarah tended his wounds and watched the road for Baker's return. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing the evening's violence. Outside, the rain washed away the blood and soot, but the 3 spent casings remained. Where they'd fallen, tiny monuments to the moment a wealthy stranger had chosen to stand between a widow and harm. Near dawn, James's fever broke. Sarah found herself studying his face, seeing past the fine clothes and reputation to the man beneath. His hands, she noticed, bore old calluses beneath the newer softness, marks of someone who'd known real work before wealth found him. Maybe, she thought, they were both fighting to hold on to something more precious than land or money. As the first light of morning crept through her windows, Sarah gathered the spent casings from the yard. 3 pieces of brass that had been meant to end a life had instead started something new. She didn't know what that something was yet, but as she listened to James's steadier breathing from her bed, where she'd insisted he rest, she felt the first stirring of hope she'd known since Thomas's death. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she opened her grandmother's healing salve, the familiar herbal scent filling the lamplit room. The small ceramic jar had been a wedding gift, passed down through generations of frontier women who understood that survival often hung by the thinnest of threads. The recipe within, a mixture of yarrow, comfrey, and other herbs gathered by knowing hands, had saved more than one life over the years. "This might sting," she warned softly, applying the salve to James's wounds. His skin burned with fever beneath her touch, but his eyes remained remarkably clear as they followed her movements. "Had worse," he managed, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his pain. "Cattle drive. 82. Horse spooked. Dragged me half a mile." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. "You were really a cowboy then?" "I thought—" She trailed off, embarrassed by her assumptions about his fine clothes and Eastern manners. A weak chuckle escaped him, ending in a grimace. "Started there, 14 years old, running from a father who wanted me in banking." He shifted slightly, allowing her better access to the wound near his shoulder. "Learned everything. From the ground up. Didn't buy my first ranch until I was 25. What changed?" Sarah asked, carefully repacking the worst of the wounds with fresh bandages. "Why go from working the land to buying it?" James was quiet so long, she thought he'd drifted off again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. "Got tired of being poor. Thought money would fill the empty spaces." His laugh was hollow. "Traded calluses for banknotes. Became the kind of man my father would have been proud of." "And are you?" Sarah reached for a cup of willow bark tea she'd prepared. "Proud of who you became?" He accepted the cup with shaking hands, their fingers brushing. "Until today, thought I was. Funny how 3 bullets can change a man's perspective." This baby kicked then, strong enough that James noticed the movement as she leaned over him. His expression softened. "How long?" "Another month, God willing." Sarah rested one hand on her belly. "Though Ellen, our midwife, thinks it might be sooner. Says the baby's already dropped." "Brave time to be standing your ground," James observed, quietly. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "When else should I stand? This land, this home, it's all I have to give my child, all that's left of their father." "Tell me about him?" James asked, and something in his tone made it more than mere politeness. Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Thomas was solid, the kind of man who built things to last. Her fingers found the wedding ring she still wore. We met when he was putting up barns for my father. He had this way of seeing the good in everything, even this played-out piece of land nobody else wanted. Said with enough love and work, anything could flourish. He was right. James's voice was soft. Your garden, the repairs, even the way you hung the laundry, everything speaks of care. You noticed all that? Been watching, past few days. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Told myself it was business interest, looking for weaknesses, ways to pressure the sale like I've done before. What did you find instead? Strength. His hand. Found hers in the lamplight. The kind that makes a man ashamed of his own weakness. Sarah should have pulled away. It wasn't proper, this midnight intimacy with a stranger. But his hand was warm despite the fever, and there was something in his eyes that spoke to the loneliness she'd been carrying since Thomas's death. Rest, she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand. Dawn's coming soon, and the Baker gang won't stay gone forever. Sarah. His voice stopped her at the door. That salve smells like my mother's garden. She grew herbs too. Used to tend them every morning before father woke. Only time I ever saw her truly happy. She touched the ceramic jar, thinking of all the women who'd carried it before her. Sometimes the smallest things we inherit are the most precious. Yes, James murmured, drifting finally toward sleep. Sometimes they are. Sarah stood watch. Through the remaining hours of darkness, one hand on her grandmother's jar, the other on her belly where new life grew. Outside, the nightbirds began their pre-dawn chorus, and somewhere in the distance coyotes called to their mates. The sound was lonely, yet carried a strange note of hope, like something wild and beautiful calling out across the darkness, waiting for an answer. The broken window frame cast fractured shadows across the kitchen floor as dawn crept over the horizon. Sarah stood before it, one hand resting on her belly, the other tracing the splintered wood where Baker's bullets had torn through. The damage seemed to mock her attempts at maintaining order, a harsh reminder of how quickly peace could shatter. Looks like the frame could be salvaged. James's voice, stronger than it had been during the night, startled her from her thoughts. He stood in the bedroom doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, but upright. His fine shirt was gone, replaced by one of Thomas's old ones she'd found in a trunk. The sight of him in her late husband's clothes stirred something unexpected in her chest. You shouldn't be up, she chided, but there was no real force behind it. During the night, something had shifted between them, like earth settling after a storm, been lying down long enough. He made his way carefully to the window, examining the damage with a craftsman's eye. Got tools? In the barn, but you're in no condition. A man can hold a saw, even with a few holes in him. His attempt at humor fell flat as he winced, pressing a hand to his bandaged chest. Besides, can't leave a lady with a broken window. Not with Baker's boys still out there. Sarah watched him study the frame, noting how his hands moved over the wood, with familiar confidence, despite his injuries. You've done this before. Windows, I mean. Built my first ranch house from the ground up. A shadow crossed his face. Sold it 2 years later for twice what it was worth. First real profit I ever made. After that, he trailed off, shame coloring his words. After that, it became easier to buy than build, Sarah finished softly. Yes, he met her eyes. Easier, but not better. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the kitchen with honest clarity. Bullet holes peppered the walls, the water barrel lay in ruins, and scorch marks from the attempted arson marred the outer walls. Yet somehow, in the fresh light of dawn, these wounds to her home felt less like defeat and more like badges of survival. I'll need to go into town, James said after a long moment. Get supplies for repairs. Send a telegram. Alarm flashed through Sarah. The Baker gang need to be dealt with properly. His voice hardened. I've got connections in the territorial and capital, men who owe me favors, time they earned their keep. And you? Sarah found herself asking. "Will you ride away once the repairs are done and the law arrives?" James turned to her, his expression complex. "Would you want me to stay?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Before she could answer, a sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Sarah reached for her rifle, but James was already moving, positioning himself between her and the entrance, despite his injuries. "Mrs. Matthews," Ellen's familiar voice called out. "Heard there was trouble last night. Brought breakfast and fresh bandages." The tension leaked. Out of the room, Sarah opened the door to find not just Ellen, but half a dozen women from town, arms laden with food and supplies. Their eyes widened at the sight of James Carlton in Thomas's old shirt, but to their credit, they said nothing. "Thought you might need a hand today," Ellen said, her keen eyes taking in the damage and the way James still stood protectively near Sarah. "We take care of our own in Silver Creek." "I'm not," James began, but Ellen cut him off. "3 bullets says different, Mr. Carlton." She began organizing the other women with practiced efficiency. "Mary, get that kitchen set to rights. Hannah, help me with these bandages. Rebecca, see to the window. The window's spoken for," James interrupted quietly, "if Mrs. Matthews will allow it." All eyes turned to Sarah. In that moment, she saw clearly what stood before her. Not the wealthy businessman who'd first ridden into town, but a man who'd remembered who he truly was. A builder, a protector, someone who understood the value of creating rather than merely acquiring. "Yes," she said, and it was an answer to more than just the window. "I think I would like that very much." The morning sun streamed through the broken window, catching the fragments of glass that still clung to the frame. Each piece caught the light differently, transforming what was broken into something that, while changed, held its own kind of beauty. Like the first light of dawn, it carried the promise of renewal and the hope of something being built stronger than before. The hand-carved wooden crutch stood in the corner of Sarah's kitchen, its pine surface already beginning to shine from use. Old Joe, the town's carpenter, had delivered it himself that morning, refusing payment with a gruff, "Man takes 3 bullets defending a widow, least we can do is help him walk straight." James eyed the crutch with barely concealed frustration as he struggled to rise from the kitchen chair. 3 days had passed since the shooting, and his body's weakness grated against his pride like sand in a wound. "I can manage without it," he insisted, even as his legs trembled with the effort of standing. Sarah continued kneading bread dough, purposefully not watching his struggle. She'd learned quickly that direct offers of help only made him withdraw further. "Suit yourself," she said mildly, "though I'd hate to have to explain to Ellen why you've torn your stitches again." The mention of the midwife made James wince. Ellen's tongue-lashing after his first attempt to help with repairs had been legendary. Making his way to the crutch with careful dignity, he muttered, "That woman could make a cavalry sergeant blush." "She's delivered 3 generations of Silver Creek babies," Sarah replied, hiding a smile. "Says there's nothing more stubborn than a man who won't admit he needs help." James adjusted the crutch under his arm, finding the rhythm that hurt least. "Used to be better at this," he admitted quietly. "Accepting help, I mean, before I got rich enough to buy my way out of needing it." Sarah's hands stilled in the dough. "What changed? Success, I suppose." He made his way to the window. The one he'd insisted on fixing himself, though it had taken twice as long with his injuries. When you have enough money, people stop offering help and start asking for it. Makes it hard to tell genuine kindness from ulterior motives. "And now?" Sarah asked, watching him trace the new window frame with calloused fingers. "Can you tell the difference?" His eyes met hers in the morning light, getting better at it every day. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. Then the baby kicked hard enough to make Sarah gasp, breaking the tension. James was at her side instantly, forgetting his crutch and his concern. It clattered to the floor as he reached to steady her. "I'm fine," she assured him, but didn't pull away from his supporting hand at her elbow. "Someone's just eager to join the conversation." James's free hand hovered uncertainly near her belly. "May I?" The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Sarah nodded, guiding his palm to where the baby moved restlessly. His intake of breath at the strong kick made her smile. "Quite a fighter you've got there," he said softly. "Like father, like child." The words slipped out before she could catch them, and she felt James start to withdraw. But instead of pulling away completely, his hand moved to cover hers, where it rested on her belly. "Thomas would be proud," he said, "of both of you." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. Most men wouldn't mention another woman's dead husband. Most men wouldn't be standing in another man's kitchen, wearing his shirt either. James's voice held a note of self-deprecation. "But here we are, Sarah echoed, allowing herself to lean slightly into his strength. "A widow and a wounded businessman, making bread and discussing babies." "Reformed businessman," he corrected, reaching awkwardly for the fallen crutch. "Or trying to be." Sarah moved to help him, but he managed it himself, though not without effort. Progress, she thought, watching him adjust his stance. Learning to accept help didn't mean never doing things on your own. "The telegram I sent," James said suddenly, "to my contacts in the capital. They've answered. The territorial marshal will be here within the week. And the Baker gang won't wait that long once word spreads." His expression hardened. "We'll need to be ready." Sarah nodded, returning to her bread-making with renewed purpose. "Then we'd better get you properly healed. Ellen's coming by this afternoon to check your wounds." James groaned theatrically, but she noticed he was already moving more confidently. "With the crutch. That woman enjoys torturing me." "She enjoys healing you," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Like the difference between buying something and earning it?" "Exactly." Sarah shaped the dough with practiced hands, adding softly, "Some things can't be bought, Mr. Carlton. They can only be given freely and received with grace." Standing in her sunlit kitchen, leaning on a crutch carved by caring hands, James Carlton began to understand just how much he had yet to learn about true wealth. The old carpenter's tools lay spread across Sarah's porch like a timeline of Thomas's life. Each worn handle and nicked blade told its own story: the hammer that had built their first barn, the saw that had shaped their kitchen cabinets, the plane that had smoothed their bedroom door. Now these tools, these silent witnesses to her previous life, were finding new purpose in different hands. James ran his fingers over the tools' worn surfaces, reading their history like braille. "Good steel," he commented, testing the hammers. "Wait, your husband knew quality. He said his father taught him that cheap tools make expensive mistakes." Sarah settled into her rocking chair, her advancing pregnancy making even simple tasks more challenging. "I've been saving them for the baby, but they shouldn't sit idle when there's work to be done," James finished, selecting the saw. His wounds were healing well enough now that Ellen had grudgingly approved light labor. The crutch stood forgotten against the wall, needed less with each passing day. Together they surveyed the damage to the homestead. The Baker gang's attack had left more than bullet holes: broken fences, scorched siding, a damaged roof. Each injury to the property seemed to mirror the wounds they were both healing from, visible and invisible alike. "Where should we start?" Sarah asked, watching James analyze the work ahead with a builder's eye. "Roof first," he decided. "Rain's coming next week. Everything else can wait, but a leaky roof can destroy a home from the inside out." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about buildings. As James began gathering materials, Sarah found herself studying him. The fine clothes he'd arrived in were long packed away, replaced by work clothes that suited him better. His hands, once softened by years of boardroom dealings, were beginning to reclaim their calluses. But it was his eyes that had changed most. The calculating businessman's gaze replaced by something warmer, more present. "I can feel you watching," he said without turning around, a smile in his voice. "Just making sure you don't overdo it," she replied. "Ellen will have both our hides if you tear those stitches again." "Ellen," James grunted, beginning to sort roofing nails, "is not the boss of me. Tell her that yourself next time." Their laughter mingled in the morning air. comfortable as old friends. These moments had been coming more frequently. Small jokes, shared glances, the easy silence of people who didn't need to fill every space with words. James began work on the roof repair, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who knew the cost of wasted motion. Sarah handed up tools and materials when needed, their teamwork falling into natural rhythm. Between tasks, he told stories of his early ranching days, cattle drives and bunkhouse pranks, the simple joy of work done well. Bought my first suit with money from that job, he remembered, carefully fitting a new shingle into place. Thought it would make me feel like I'd finally arrived. Did it? For a while. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. But suits don't keep you warm at night. Success is a cold bedfellow. Sarah absorbed this, thinking of her own nights since Thomas's death. Loneliness comes in many forms, I suppose. Yes, James met her eyes. And healing too, if we're brave enough to accept it. The moment was interrupted by the baby's vigorous kicking. Sarah laughed, pressing a hand to her side. Someone's eager to help with the repairs. James climbed down from the roof, his movements still careful but stronger than days before. May I? At her nod, he placed his hand beside hers, wonder crossing his features at the strong movements beneath. Definitely takes after their mother. Same determination. And their father's strength, Sarah added softly, then clarified, Thomas was always so steady, so sure of his path. Tell me about him, James asked, settling beside her on the porch steps. The man who built this place? Sarah picked up a worn chisel, its handle smooth from years of use. He could see possibility everywhere. When we first came here, this was just scrubland everyone else had passed over. But Thomas saw rich soil under the tough grass, good drainage for crops, perfect placement for a home. She smiled at the memory. Said anything worth having was worth working for. Wise man. James took the chisel, turning it in his hands. Wish I'd learned that lesson sooner myself. You're learning it now, Sarah observed. Sometimes the best lessons come later in life. Thunder rolled in the distance, promising the predicted rain. James stood, offering Sarah his hand. Better finish that roof then. Wouldn't want all our hard work to go to waste. As they returned to their tasks, Sarah noticed how naturally they moved together now, anticipating each other's needs, sharing the work like they'd been doing it for years instead of days. Sometimes she realized rebuilding wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something new from the pieces that remained. The newspaper clipping fluttered on Mrs. Peterson's counter like a fallen leaf, its bold headline. Catching Sarah's eye, wealthy investor takes stand against land grabbers. Below, in smaller print, James Carlton, known for aggressive business tactics, now defending widow's homestead. Sarah's cheeks warmed as Mrs. Peterson hastily swept the paper aside. Don't pay it any mind, dear. That reporter from the territorial paper was just passing through, stirring up stories. But the whispers followed Sarah through the general store as she gathered her weekly supplies. Living under the same roof, one woman murmured. And her in her condition, another voice answered. Well, Ellen visits daily, so there's propriety. At least, Sarah kept her spine straight the way her mother had taught her. Let them talk. They didn't understand how the nights stretched long and dark, how much it meant to hear another person's breathing in the house again, to know someone stood ready to face whatever threats might come. Your usual order, Mrs. Matthews. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the whispers. And will Mr. Carlton be needing more work shirts? Those fine ones of his aren't suited for ranch work. Just the usual, thank you. Sarah began counting out her money, but Mrs. Peterson waved it away. Already settled, Mr. Carlton arranged a standing account. At Sarah's frown, she added quickly, Now don't go getting prideful, dear. Man's got a right to contribute if he's eating at your table and sleeping under your roof. Sleeping in the barn, Sarah corrected quietly, though the distinction felt hollow even to her own ears. James had insisted on making his bed in the stable despite his healing wounds, maintaining At least the appearance of propriety. Mrs. Peterson's eyes softened. You know, I remember when Thomas first started courting you. People talked then too, said you were too educated for a carpenter, that you'd never be happy on a small homestead. She began wrapping Sarah's purchases with careful hands. But Thomas saw something in this land, in the life you could build here. Sometimes other people's eyes aren't the ones we need to be looking through. The bell above the door chimed, and James himself entered, carrying a repaired harness over his shoulder. The store fell silent as every head turned to watch him make his way to the counter. Sarah noticed he'd stopped trying to hide his limp. The wounds still troubled him, but he wore them now like badges rather than burdens. Mrs. Peterson, he nodded politely. Mrs. Matthews. His tone was carefully formal, but his eyes held warmth when they met Sarah's. Thought you might need help with the packages. More whispers rustled through the store. James ignored them, with the ease of a man who'd spent years being talked about in boardrooms and back offices. But Sarah saw how his jaw tightened slightly, how his hand gripped the harness a fraction harder. Actually, she said loud enough to carry, I was hoping you'd look at the chicken coop when we get back. The door's sticking again, and you seem to have a way with repairs. His smile reached his eyes, understanding her intent to normalize their situation. Happy to help, though I recall someone saying just yesterday that my carpentry was enthusiastic but uneven. Better than my attempt, Sarah returned easily. Unless you prefer eggs rolling across the floor every morning. Their shared laughter seemed to break some invisible tension in the room. Mrs. Peterson began chattering about feed prices. Other customers returned to their shopping, and the whispers faded to background noise. Outside, James loaded the supplies into her wagon with careful efficiency. You shouldn't have to defend yourself, he said quietly, or me. Nor should you have to sleep in the barn with 3 healing bullet wounds, she countered. But here we are. He helped her up to the wagon seat, his hands strong and sure. Here we are indeed, a respectable widow and a reformed robber baron, scandalizing the good people of Silver Creek. Former robber baron, Sarah corrected, hiding a smile. I'd say you're more of a reconstruction specialist these days. James settled beside her, taking up the reins. Speaking of reconstruction, that chicken coop really does need attention. Unless you were just creating a distraction back there. Oh no, Mr. Carlton. You volunteered quite publicly. No backing. Out now. Their laughter floated back toward the town, carried on the warm afternoon breeze. Let them whisper, Sarah thought. Some things were worth a little scandal. The threatening note was nailed to Sarah's fence post at dawn, its crude letters stark against the weathered wood. Time's up, widow. Carlton can't watch you forever. Smart money sells. Dead folks can't own land. James found it first during his morning check of the property. He stood there now in the pearl-grey light of early morning, reading the words again, as if they might somehow change. His fingers traced the nail holes in the wood, fresh wounds in the fence he'd just repaired days ago. They're watching the property, he said without turning as Sarah approached. Her footsteps on the frost-covered grass had announced her presence. Getting bolder, or more desperate, Sarah pulled her shawl tighter against the dawn chill. The marshal's due next week. They know their time is running out. James carefully folded the note and tucked it into his pocket, which makes them more dangerous. Desperate men do desperate things. I won't be frightened off my land. Sarah's voice held steel, but her hand rested protectively over her belly, now heavy with her nearly full-term child. No, James agreed, turning to face her. But we need to be smarter than them. Baker's not just a common thug. He thinks like a businessman. His mouth twisted on the word. I should know. Used similar tactics myself once upon a time. Legal ones, but the principle was the same. What changed? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. His eyes met hers, more open than she'd ever seen them. Met someone who reminded me what it means to stand for something real. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Then a horse whinnied in the distance, not one of theirs, and reality crashed back in. James moved instantly, positioning himself between Sarah and the potential threat. "Inside," he said quietly. "We need to prepare." Throughout the morning, they worked with quiet efficiency. James taught Sarah how to reinforce the window shutters with metal strapping he'd salvaged from old machinery. She showed him the root cellar Thomas had dug extra deep, with a hidden tunnel that led to the creek bed. Her husband's paranoia about flash floods now serving a different purpose. "Thomas thought of everything," James commented as they stored extra supplies below ground. "He knew what it meant to build something worth protecting." Sarah arranged medical supplies on a shelf, trying not to think about why they might need them. "Sometimes I wonder if he knew, if he sensed he wouldn't always be here to do the protecting himself." James touched her shoulder gently. "He chose. Well, in choosing you." The sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever she might have said in response. They hurried up from the cellar to find Jake Baker himself sitting his horse in their yard, flanked by 4 riders. The morning sun caught the red bandana at his throat, making it look like a bloody slash. "Ain't this cozy?" Baker called out. "Playing house with the widow, Carlton? Bit beneath your usual standards, ain't it?" James stepped forward, his voice carrying the smooth authority of boardroom negotiations. "This is private property, Baker. The lady has made her wishes clear. Lady's got more than herself to think about now." Baker's eyes fixed on Sarah's obvious pregnancy. "Be a shame if anything happened to complicate things this late in the game. Lot can go wrong with a birth, I hear. Especially if the nearest doctor's been delayed." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sarah felt James tense beside her, but kept her own voice steady. "Are you threatening my midwife, Mr. Baker?" "Just making conversation, ma'am, pointing out how isolated you are out here, how vulnerable." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, I'm a reasonable man. Got papers right here." He patted his saddlebag. "Fair price for the land, considering. The price of 3 bullets wasn't fair enough for you." James's voice had gone deadly quiet. Baker's smile vanished. "You ain't the only one can send telegrams, Carlton. Word is you've gone soft. Benkin friends in Denver ain't too happy about you playing white knight out here in the territories. Might be time to cut your losses. Head back east where you belong." Sarah watched the words hit James like physical blows. His old life reaching out to tug him back, testing his newfound convictions. Without thinking, she stepped forward and took his hand. The simple gesture spoke volumes. James's fingers tightened around hers as he addressed Baker. "My place is here. As for my business, associates, they're welcome to their opinions. And their lawyers, I've got a few of my own." Baker spat in the dirt. "Suit yourself, but ask the widow there what happened to the last man who stood between me and land I wanted." He wheeled his horse, his men following suit. 3 days, Carlton. Then we do this the hard way." They watched the riders disappear down the road. Only when they were out of sight did James release Sarah's hand. "I should go into town," he said. "Send more telegrams. Call in whatever favors I have left. Or," Sarah said quietly, "you could stay. Help me finish reinforcing our home." Our home. The words hung between them, a declaration and a question both. James looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and deliberately tore Baker's threatening note to pieces. The wind caught the fragments, carrying them away across the morning frost grass. "The shutters still need work," he said simply, and together they turned back to the task of defending what was theirs. The old photograph slipped from James's wallet as he reached for matches to light the evening lamps. It fluttered to the floor, like a fallen leaf landing face up in the fading light. Sarah, settling into her rocking chair with her mending, caught a glimpse of a younger James standing beside a weather-beaten cabin, his arm around a silver-haired woman with kind eyes. "Your mother?" she asked softly, recognizing something of his stance in the woman's proud bearing. James picked up the photograph with careful fingers, as if it might crumble at a careless touch. "Yes, taken at my first homestead, the one I built. Myself." His voice carried an old ache. "Last time I saw her smile like that. Tell me." Sarah set aside her mending, recognizing the weight of memories needing to be shared. James settled into Thomas's old chair. He'd stopped hesitating to use it these past few days. Another small barrier quietly crossed. She loved gardens, he began, his fingers tracing the photograph's worn edges. Had the finest herb garden in Boston, tucked behind my father's grand house. It was her refuge, the only place she truly came alive. He paused, lost in memory. When I ran west at 14, it nearly broke her heart. But she understood. She'd seen what life with my father had done to my older brothers, turned them into copies of him, all ambition and no soul. What happened to the cabin? Sarah asked. Though she suspected she knew, sold it 2 years after this picture was taken. Shame colored his voice. Mother had come out to visit, helped me plant a garden just like her old one. Said she'd never seen me so content. He laughed bitterly. A week later, a man offered me twice what the place was worth. I convinced myself I was being smart, building capital for bigger things. Your mother didn't see it that way. She saw right through me, said I was becoming what I'd run from. James carefully returned the photograph to his wallet. Last real conversation we ever had. She passed 3 years later, with my father still complaining about the money she wasted on her gardens. Sarah watched him in the deepening twilight, seeing past the wealthy businessman to the young man who'd once built a cabin with his own hands. And after that, threw myself into business, told myself I was honoring my father's legacy, proving myself worthy of the Carlton name. His smile held no warmth. Bought and sold ranches across 3 territories. Never stayed anywhere long enough to plant so much as a single herb. Until now, Sarah observed quietly. Until now. James met her eyes. Funny thing about taking 3 bullets. Makes a man reconsider his choices. Makes him wonder if maybe his mother saw clearer than he did. The baby kicked then, strong enough to make Sarah shift in her chair. James was beside her instantly, concern replacing introspection. You all right? Just someone making their presence known, she assured him, then daringly took his hand and placed it where the baby moved. Feel that? That's what real legacy looks like. James's breath caught as tiny feet or hands pressed against his palm. Sarah, I know what people say, she interrupted gently, that you're here out of guilt or duty, or some kind of redemption seeking. But I've seen you with the tools, James, seen your hands remember skills your mind thought forgotten. You're not playing at anything here. No, he agreed softly, not playing at all. His hand remained warm against her belly, anchoring them both in the moment. Your Thomas built something real here, something that matters. I'd forgotten what that felt like. And now? Now I remember every time I fix a fence post or repair a shutter. Every morning I walk this land and see possibilities instead of profit margins. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Every time I watch you tend your garden, looking so much like your mother in her refuge. Yes, the word came out rough with emotion. Sarah, I need you to know. If Baker comes, when Baker comes, I won't run this time, won't sell what matters for what pays. I know, she said simply, covering his hand with hers where it still rested against her child. I've known since you took those bullets. Some men wear their true selves like your father wore his wealth, on the outside for show. Others bury it deep, like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing, bright against the darkening sky. In the garden Sarah had planted, herbs much like those in a long-ago Boston sanctuary lifted their leaves to catch the evening dew. And in the quiet of the gathering night, 2 people who had known loss felt the first stirrings of something new taking root. The shared meal basket appeared on Sarah's porch just after dawn, steam still rising from beneath its checkered cloth. Cover. Inside, she found Mrs. Peterson's famous sourdough bread, Ellen's herb-roasted chicken, and enough other dishes to feed half the county. Tucked alongside was a note in Ellen's firm hand. A woman needs her strength, both for what's coming and what's growing. 3rd one this week, James commented, coming up behind her. He'd taken to rising before dawn to check the property. His limp now, barely noticeable. Seems the whole town's decided to fatten us up. Not just food, Sarah said, nodding toward the barn where old Joe had appeared yesterday with a wagon load of lumber and his tools. They're choosing sides. Choosing life, came Ellen's voice, as the midwife rounded the corner of the house. She carried her medical bag and what looked suspiciously like more baked goods, as that little one of yours will be doing any day now. Sarah pressed a hand to her lower back, feeling the familiar tightening that had been increasing lately. Still a few weeks to go. Babies come in their own time, Ellen said wisely, then turned to James. And you, Mr. Carlton, those stitches healing clean? James straightened instinctively under her scrutiny. Yes, ma'am, though I reckon you'll check them anyway. Smart man. Learning already. Ellen's eyes twinkled. Speaking of learning, the Ladies' Auxiliary is planning a welcome celebration. Welcome? Sarah asked, confused. For whom? For the little one, of course. Though some might say it's as much for the man who took 3 bullets defending one of our own. Ellen began unpacking her bag with practiced efficiency. Time was, Mr. Carlton, when your name around here meant business deals and foreclosures. Funny how a few weeks and some honest sweat can change folks' minds. James looked uncomfortable with the praise. Done nothing any man wouldn't do. That's where you're wrong, came a new voice. They turned to find Reverend Mills approaching, his collar bright white against his dusty riding clothes. Plenty wouldn't have stood their ground. More wouldn't have stayed to rebuild. He extended his hand to James. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Mr. Carlton. Sometimes it takes a bullet or 3 to show a man his true path. Sarah watched as James shook the Reverend's hand, noting how naturally he fit into this tableau of community life. Gone was the calculating businessman who'd first ridden into town. In his place stood a man who looked at home with dirt under his nails and responsibilities weighing on his shoulders. Now then, Ellen announced, all business. Sarah, let's check on that. Baby, Mr. Carlton, the Reverend brought some news about Baker's gang you'll want to hear. She shooed the men toward the barn with practiced authority. Later, as the afternoon sun gilded the autumn leaves, Sarah found James splitting wood with focused intensity. Bad news about Baker? He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Moving, men into position. Reverend passed 3 riders on his way here, heading toward Baker's usual camp. His eyes met hers. It's coming, Sarah. Sooner rather than later. I know. She settled onto the chopping stump, one hand supporting her back. Ellen says the baby's dropped. Could be any time now. James's axe thudded into the chopping block. Sarah? He struggled visibly with what to say next. Don't, she said firmly. Don't suggest I leave. This is my home. Our home, she added softly, including him in the word that meant everything. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Then we prepare, together, as if in response. To their words, more wagons appeared on the road to their homestead. Old Joe returned with more lumber. Mrs. Peterson's husband brought metal strapping for reinforcing doors. Even the sheriff's deputy rode out, officially to check on things, but staying to help James sight in his rifle. Takes a community to raise a child, Ellen observed, watching the activity from the porch. Takes one to defend a home, too. Sarah looked out over her land, their land, seeing not just property now, but the web of connections that made it. Truly valuable. Every nail driven, every meal shared, every helping hand extended was a thread in that web, strengthening them all. Baker doesn't understand that, she said quietly. He sees the land, the water rights, the profit, but he doesn't see this. No, Ellen agreed, patting her hand. And that's why, in the end, he'll lose. The broken watch chain lay coiled in James's palm like a tiny silver snake, its delicate links shattered by the bullet that had nearly found his heart. Baker's first shot had struck true, but the thick silver chain, his father's last gift, had deflected just enough steel to spare his life. It's starting, he said quietly, watching dust clouds rise on the horizon. Dawn was still an hour away. But the Baker gang wasn't waiting for daylight. Their horses' hooves drummed a distant thunder, growing louder with each passing minute. Sarah stood at the window, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other cradling her belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the approaching storm. How many? More than last time. Probably 15. James tucked the broken chain into his pocket. Ellen's safely away? Left at midnight through the creek tunnel. She'll have reached town by now. Sarah's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her concern. The deputy? Posted men along the ridge. They'll come when they hear gunfire. He moved to her side, his hand finding hers in the pre-dawn darkness. Still time for you to go. The tunnel? No. The word was quiet, but final. My water broke. An hour ago. James's fingers tightened on hers. Sarah, this baby will be born on this land, she said with quiet determination. In the home their father built. The home you helped defend. A contraction rippled through her, and she breathed through it with practiced calm. Ellen showed me what to do. I've helped birth enough calves and neighbors' babies to manage. The thunder of hooves grew louder. James pressed his forehead to hers for one brief moment. I love you, he said simply. Should have said it sooner. I know. She smiled despite her pain. Now go show them what a reformed robber baron can do. He kissed her once, fierce and quick, then moved to take his position. The townspeople had helped them prepare well. Old Joe's reinforced shutters turned the house into a fortress. The barn held surprises of its own, rigged with trip lines and strategic weaknesses that would work to their advantage. The first riders appeared in the grey light, Baker's red bandana like a splash of blood against the dawn. They pulled up just beyond rifle range, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Last chance, Carlton, Baker's voice carried across the distance. Walk away now. You might still have a business left when the dust settles. James's answer was to step out onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. 15 against 1, Baker. Thought you had more style than that. Ain't about style anymore. Baker spat into the dirt. Got investors waiting on this land, people a lot less patient than me. Funny thing about investors, James called back. They get nervous when things go wrong. Tell me, did you mention in your telegrams that you failed to take this land twice already? That your simple widow has cost you men and reputation? He saw the words hit home, saw Baker's men shifting uneasily in their saddles. Behind him, through the reinforced door, he heard Sarah's quiet moan as another contraction built. Enough talk! Baker drew his pistol. Burn them out! The gang surged forward, but James was already moving. His first shot caught Baker's right hand, man in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The second found another rider's leg. He worked the lever action smoothly, each shot deliberate, making them count. From the ridge came answering fire, the deputy's men joining the fight. But Baker's gang had numbers and desperation on their side. Bullets splintered wood around James as he dove for cover. Through the chaos, he heard Sarah cry out in pain. The battle became a blur of smoke and thunder. James moved from position to position, using every trick the land offered. A rider fell to a tripline in the barn. Another took a bullet trying to torch the woodpile. But still they came. Inside, Sarah fought her own battle. Between contractions, she managed to drag herself to the window, using Thomas's old rifle to pick off anyone who got too close to the house. Her shots weren't as accurate as James's, but they kept the attackers honest. Getting tired, Carlton? Baker's voice rang out. Can't protect her forever? James reloaded behind a rain barrel, his father's broken watch chain cool against his chest. Never was about protecting her, Baker, he shouted back. Lady does fine on her own. I'm just honored to stand beside her. As if in answer to his words, Sarah's rifle cracked from the window, the bullet cutting through Baker's red bandana. The gang leader clutched his bleeding ear, rage twisting his features. Burn it, he screamed. Burn it all! They came in a rush then, all pretense at strategy abandoned. James met them with calculated fury, each shot placed with the precision he'd once used to close business deals. But they were too many, getting too close. A torch arced through the air, landing on the roof. Another followed. James's heart clenched. As he saw smoke begin to rise, from inside came Sarah's cry, not of pain this time, but of determination. Then, cutting through the gunfire, came a new sound. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. The entire town seemed to materialize out of the dawn. Leading them was Ellen, shotgun braced against her shoulder. Behind her rode the Reverend, Mrs. Peterson's husband, Old Joe, and dozens more. Even Mrs. Peterson herself drove. A wagon, armed with her late husband's Civil War cavalry sword. "Silver Creek takes care of its own," Ellen's voice rang out above the chaos. Her shotgun roared, and Baker's horse reared, dumping him in the dust. The gang's nerve broke, facing townspeople on one side and the deputy's men on the other. They turned to run, but Baker wasn't finished. Rolling to his feet, he drew a hidden pistol and aimed at the house, at the window where Sarah still stood. James didn't think, didn't plan. He simply moved faster than he ever had in his life. His body slammed into Baker as the gun went off. They crashed together in the dirt, grappling for control. Baker was younger, stronger, fueled by rage and humiliation. But James Carlton had found something worth fighting for. The broken watch chain swung from his fist as he struck. It's silver, links adding weight to the blow. Baker went limp, and James staggered to his feet just as the deputy's men reached them. "James!" Ellen's voice cut through his battle haze. "The baby's coming, now!" He ran for the house, leaving Baker to justice and the townspeople to handle. The fires. Sarah lay on their bed. Yes, their bed now, no more pretense about the barn, her face radiant despite her pain. "Took you long enough," she gasped as another contraction peaked. "Had to give our child a proper welcome story." He took her hand, amazed by her strength. "Something worth telling on cold nights." Ellen appeared with hot water and clean linens. "Less talking, more pushing," she commanded. "This little one's eager to see what all the fuss is about." Outside, the sun finally crested the horizon. The townspeople worked together to put out the fires, repair what damage they could. The deputy led Baker and his captured men away in chains. And inside the homestead, as the morning light painted the walls gold, a new life came into the world. "A girl," Ellen announced proudly, placing the squalling bundle in Sarah's arms. Strong and perfect. James stared at the tiny face, his heart too full for words. Sarah touched his cheek, wiping away tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. "Welcome home," she whispered, and he knew she wasn't just talking to their daughter. The broken watch chain lay forgotten in his pocket, its silver links testimony to how quickly life could change. But as James Carlton held his new family close, he realized some things didn't need mending. Some breaks were meant to happen, clearing the way for something stronger to grow in their place. The fresh-cut house key caught the afternoon sunlight as James placed it in Sarah's palm. It's brass, surface still warm from the blacksmith's forge. Simple, sturdy, and new, like the life they were building together. Their daughter Grace, just 2 weeks old, slept peacefully in her cradle nearby, undisturbed by the quiet conversation. "Had it made this morning," James said softly, watching. Sarah's fingers close around the key. "Thought it was time to stop pretending I'm still sleeping in the barn." Sarah smiled, remembering how that pretense had gradually fallen away during her recovery, with James sleeping in Thomas's old chair beside her bed, unwilling to leave her or Grace unprotected even after Baker's arrest. "The town will talk." "Town's already talking." He sat beside her on the porch swing that Old Joe had helped him build last week. "Reverend Mills asked me after services yesterday if we'd be wanting to make things official." "And what did you tell him?" Sarah kept her tone light, though her heart beat faster. "Told him I'd ask the lady in question when the time was right." James took her free hand, his calluses matching her own now. "Seems to me we've done everything backward, faced death together, brought a child into the world, built a home. Might as well take our time with the formalities." A rider appeared on the road, the deputy returning from escorting Baker and his remaining men to the territorial prison. He waved as he passed, and they waved back, the gesture natural as breathing. The homestead had become a regular stop for townspeople now, with visitors bringing everything from baby clothes to building supplies. "Got another telegram from Denver this morning," James said after a while. "Banking partners want to know if I'm coming back. Offered to buy out my shares if I'm determined to go native," as they put it. Sarah tensed slightly. "And are you going back?" In answer, James pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket, the deed to his Denver office building. Without ceremony, he tore it in half. "Already wrote back accepting their offer. Got better investments here." "Oh," Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Well, there's this chicken coop that needs expanding. Thought we might add a proper dairy barn come spring. Maybe plant an herb garden." His voice softened. "Your Thomas had good ideas about this land. Seems right to see them through." Sarah touched his cheek, feeling the afternoon stubble there. "And what would your father say about such investments?" "Nothing good," James smiled. "But my mother would have loved it, especially the garden." He glanced at the key still nestled in Sarah's palm. "So what do you say? Ready to officially take in a reformed robber baron?" "I don't know," Sarah teased. "Your carpentry is still a bit uneven." "True, but I'm learning." He drew her closer. "Got a lifetime to get better at it." Grace stirred. In her cradle, making the small fussing sounds that preceded hunger, Sarah moved to tend to her, but not before pressing the new key firmly back into James's hand. "Ask me properly," she said softly. "When you're ready. For now, come help me with our daughter." James stared at the key, emotion tight in his throat. "Our daughter," he repeated wonderingly. "Never thought I'd hear those words. Never thought I'd be starting over," Sarah admitted, lifting Grace to her breast. "But here we are. Here we are," James agreed, settling beside them. He watched their daughter nurse, marveling at how something so small could make the world seem so large with possibility. Through the window came the sounds of Silver Creek life. Wagon wheels on the road, cattle lowing in distant fields, the sheriff's horse clopping past on evening rounds. The town was changing, growing. Baker's arrest had brought new settlers, honest folks drawn by stories of a community that stood together. The afternoon light softened toward evening, painting the walls with amber warmth. James found himself studying the way it caught the silver threads in Sarah's hair, the way Grace's tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. His mother would have called this a moment of grace, something precious and freely given, like the flowers in her long-ago garden. Sarah hummed softly to their daughter, a lullaby that spoke of home and belonging. James recognized the tune, had heard Thomas's sister singing it at church. Another thread woven into their tapestry, binding past and present into something new and strong. The key in his pocket seemed to warm against his heart, like a promise waiting to be kept. Not yet, but soon. Some things were worth taking slow, worth building proper foundations for. He had learned that lesson well, here on this land that had taught him to measure wealth not in dollars, but in moments just like this. The handmade quilt grew beneath Sarah's fingers as she worked in the evening lamplight, each carefully stitched square telling its own story. This patch from her wedding dress, that one from Thomas's favorite shirt, another from the fine silk vest James had worn the day he took 3 bullets for them. And there, in the center, a square of soft flannel from Grace's first blanket. "It's beautiful," James said softly, pausing in his own work of repairing harness leather by the fire, "like a story sewn in cloth." Mother always said quilts were family histories. Sarah smiled as Grace, sleeping in her cradle nearby, made tiny, dreaming sounds. Each piece carries memories, and together they keep us warm. Outside, the first real snow of winter fell steadily, blanketing their world in hushed white. James had spent weeks preparing for this, banking the house foundation with straw, replacing worn shingles, ensuring the root cellar was properly stocked. Sarah had watched him work with quiet appreciation, noting how naturally he'd taken to the rhythms of homestead life. "Supposed to be a hard winter," he commented, testing the strength of his stitching. Old Joe says, when the squirrels gather this early, we're in for a long, cold spell. Then we'll have more time for indoor projects. Sarah nodded toward the shelf of books he'd brought back from his last trip to Denver. Not to reclaim his business life, but to sell the last of his holdings. The money had gone into improvements for the homestead. A proper dairy barn for spring, seed for next year's expanded gardens, and books for winter evenings and Grace's education. Speaking of projects, James set aside his leatherwork and retrieved a package wrapped in brown paper. Brought this back too, thought it might interest you. Sarah unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound notebook and several packets of seeds. Her breath caught as she read the labels, all herbs, some familiar, some exotic. James, found my mother's garden journal in storage, he explained. Thought she'd like knowing her knowledge was being put to use. That something of her would grow here. Sarah touched the journal's worn cover reverently. Tell me about her? About the garden. James moved to sit beside her on the settle, their shoulders touching comfortably. She grew everything with a purpose. Lavender for sleep, chamomile for peace, rosemary for remembrance. Said a proper garden was like a proper life, needed both beauty and usefulness to thrive. She sounds wise. She was. He helped Sarah fold the quilt, his hands gentle with her handiwork. Would have loved you. Loved seeing Grace grow up surrounded by growing things. As if hearing her name, Grace stirred and whimpered. James rose smoothly to tend her, his movements confident now, with their 2-month-old daughter. Sarah watched him lift the baby, murmuring soft greetings, and marveled at how naturally he'd taken to fatherhood. Snow's really coming down, he observed, walking Grace to the window. Glad we got that last load of hay in yesterday. Sarah joined them, wrapping her arms around both from behind. Glad we got you in from the barn before winter, too. His quiet laugh rumbled through his chest. Never really fooled anyone with that, did we? Ellen saw right through it from the start. Sarah rested her cheek against his shoulder. Said any man willing to take 3 bullets for a stranger had already declared his intentions, proper or not. Wise woman, Ellen. James shifted Grace to one arm so he could pull Sarah closer, though they weren't exactly 3 bullets for a stranger. No. He turned to face her, their daughter cradled between them. They were 3 bullets for a future. I just didn't know it at the time. The snow fell thicker outside their windows, but inside all was warm and bright. The quilt draped over Sarah's rocking chair caught the firelight, its pieces glowing like stained glass. On the table, the garden journal lay open to pages of feminine script, waiting to share its secrets come spring. And in James's mother's favorite corner of the house, dried herbs hung from the rafters, the first harvest from Sarah's own garden, planted in memory of another woman who had found peace among growing things. I've been thinking, James said after a while, settling Grace back in her cradle, about what you said, about doing things properly. Sarah's hands stilled on her quilting. Oh? Thought maybe, when the spring comes. He took her hand, his, fingers warm and sure. Thought maybe we could plant that herb garden together, make it official, all of it, if you're willing. Sarah looked around their home, at the quilted memories, the well-worn tools, the books promising future knowledge, and their sleeping daughter, and saw not what she had lost, but what she had found, what they had built together. Yes, she said simply. I'm willing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping their homestead in pristine white. But inside, surrounded by warmth and love and the promise of growing things, spring didn't seem so far away at all. The cradle sat empty in the morning sunlight, its hand-carved surface bearing witness to 3 generations of love. Thomas's father had made it for Sarah's first pregnancy. James had repaired it with careful hands, and now it would be passed on to the Cooper family's new baby, a symbol of how life in Silver Creek flowed in circles of giving and receiving. Sure you're ready to let it go? James asked softly, watching Sarah run her fingers over the smooth wood one last time. Grace, now 6 months old, sat happily in his lap, playing with his watch chain. a new one, though he kept the broken one as a reminder. "It's time," Sarah replied. "Mary Cooper's baby is due any day, and Grace has outgrown it." She smiled at their daughter, who had mastered the art of sitting up and was working determinedly on crawling. "Besides, pieces of love should be shared, not stored away." James nodded, understanding flowing between them. They'd learned that lesson well over the winter months, how love multiplied when given freely, how strength grew through sharing rather than hoarding. The town had taught them that, coming together during the hard snows, sharing food and labor and stories around warm fires. "Speaking of sharing," he said, settling Grace more comfortably as she grabbed for his buttons, "had a letter from my sister in Boston. Says she'd like to come see her new niece come summer." Sarah looked up from wrapping the cradle for transport. "The one who sided with your father, Elizabeth." "Yes." He caught Grace's exploring hands before she could pull his shirt askew. "Says losing mother made her realize some things. About family. About what matters. Like her brother taking 3 bullets made him realize some things." James smiled, acknowledging the parallel. Must run in the family, these dramatic epiphanies. Grace chose that moment to let out a peal of laughter, reaching for Sarah with complete confidence that her mother would come to her. Sarah did, of course, gathering their daughter close and breathing in her sweet morning scent. "Tell your sister yes," she said after a moment. "Family should know each other. The real kind of knowing, not just the formal Boston kind." James watched his wife and daughter together, marveling at how naturally Sarah included his family in their circle of love. She had every right to be wary after how they'd treated him, but instead she offered the same generous spirit that had helped heal his own wounded soul. "Pa!" Grace declared suddenly, reaching back for James. It was her newest word, right after Ma, and it still made his heart stop every time he heard it. "That's right, sweetheart," Sarah encouraged, passing their daughter back to him. "That's your pa, the one who helped give you this home." "One of the ones," James corrected gently, never wanting to diminish Thomas's place in their story. The former owner's tools still hung in places of honor, his work visible in every corner of their home. Sarah touched his cheek, understanding in her eyes. "Love makes room," she said simply, "just like the garden." Ah, yes, the garden. It flourished now in the spring sunshine, twice the size it had been last year. James's mother's journal had proved a treasure trove of knowledge, and Sarah had added her own notes in a clear hand beneath the older woman's script. Their daughter would grow up knowing both grandmothers through the growing things they'd loved. "Town's changing," James observed, looking out over their land where new buildings rose in the distance. Good changes, brought by honest folks drawn to Silver Creek's reputation for standing together. The Baker Gang's defeat had marked a turning point, proving that community meant more than money. "Speaking of change," Sarah said, a slight tremor in her voice. "Ellen confirmed something yesterday." James turned to her, recognizing that tone. "Sarah?" She took his free hand and pressed it to her belly, still flat but holding a secret. "Grace will need that cradle back by winter." Joy burst through him like sunshine through storm clouds. "You're sure?" "Ellen's sure." Sarah's eyes shone. "Says everything's strong and healthy, a proper spring planting," she called it. Grace patted their joined hands, babbling happily, as if she understood the moment's importance. Perhaps she did. Babies had their own wisdom, James had learned. "A proper spring planting," he repeated softly, drawing his family close. Through the window he could see the garden where Sarah had recreated his mother's healing rose. Beyond it lay the new dairy barn, the expanded fields, the future they were building day by day. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "that cradle might need a twin if we're starting a proper family tradition." Sarah laughed, the sound as bright as their daughter's. "Already thinking ahead. Always." He kissed her tenderly, then dropped a kiss on Grace's dark curls, but this time about the right things. Outside, a meadowlark trilled its morning song. Inside, a family held each other close, knowing that the real measure of wealth lay not in what you could hold, but in what you could share. The empty cradle waited by the door, ready to carry love to another home, while in Sarah's belly new love grew steady and strong. The family portrait hung in pride of place above the mantel, capturing a moment of perfect joy. Sarah sat in her rocking chair, little Grace on her lap, her second pregnancy just beginning to show. James stood behind them, one hand on Sarah's shoulder, the other holding Thomas's old carpentry tools, a gesture the photographer had suggested to honor the home's foundations. But it was the expression on James's face that truly told their story, the look of a man who had finally found his place in the world. "Still can't believe you got me to sit still for that," James commented, adding another log to the evening. Fire. Spring rain drummed steadily on the roof they'd repaired together, making their home feel even more snug and secure. "Seemed important," Sarah replied, watching Grace play with wooden blocks on a quilt spread before the hearth. "To capture this, for both our children to know their story." James settled beside her on the settle they'd built together, his hand naturally finding its way to her growing belly. "A story about a ruthless businessman who took 3 bullets? No," Sarah corrected gently. "A story about a man who remembered who he truly was, who chose building over buying, growing over taking." She covered his hand with hers, "who helped a widow defend her home and ended up finding his own." Grace toddled over with a block, offering it to them with solemn ceremony. "Pa build," she declared, then turned back to her play. "Can't argue with that wisdom," James chuckled, but his eyes were soft as he watched their daughter. She had Sarah's determination, and folks said his way of seeing straight to the heart of things. Through the window, they could see their expanded garden, where his mother's herbs grew alongside Sarah's vegetables. The diary on the shelf now held 3 generations of women's writing. His mother's elegant script, Sarah's clear hand, and blank pages waiting for Grace's own discoveries. "Your sister's letter came today," Sarah said after a while. "Says she's already packed for her summer visit. Eager to meet her niece," James smiled, "and her new niece or nephew, come winter, and to see what kind of home could make her brother choose Silver Creek over Boston society. She'll understand once she's here." James drew Sarah closer. "Some things can't be explained, only lived." Like love, Sarah thought, like the way James had transformed from a man who bought and sold homes to one who built them, like the way her heart had expanded to hold both Thomas's memory and this new joy. Grace had fallen asleep on her quilt, peaceful in the firelight. James rose quietly to gather her up, cradling her with the gentle confidence he'd earned through countless nights of patient care. Sarah watched him settle their daughter in her new bed, the one he'd carved himself, incorporating elements from Thomas's original designs. "Home," Grace murmured in her sleep, a word that held their whole world in its single syllable. "Yes, little one," James whispered, brushing back her dark curls. "We're home." And they were, all of them, the living and the remembered, the planted and the growing, the found and the rebuilt. Home at last, in a place measured not in acres or dollars, but in love given and received, in gardens planted and children raised, in memories honored and futures embraced. Together.